The rain hammered the roof of her old car, each drop a tiny, angry fist pounding against the metal. Inside, Kimmy sat shivering behind the wheel, though not from the cold. Her hands trembled, clutching the worn steering wheel as her father's final words ripped through her mind, a wound fresher and deeper than any she had ever known. "Don't come back, Kimmy, you're no longer part of this family." Her suitcase, still damp from where it had been thrown onto the wet grass, sat on the passenger seat like a silent witness to her exile. The warm, inviting porch light of her home had blinked out behind her, a final, cold rejection from the very walls that were supposed to keep her safe. Her tear-filled eyes found the worn family photo tucked into her dashboard. Through a choked sob, she whispered to the smiling face of her father, "One day, Dad. One day you'll remember who stood by you when everyone else ran away." But what? Kimmy couldn't possibly know, as she drove headfirst into the raging storm. Was that the very family who cast her out would one day crawl back, begging for the forgiveness she didn't have to give, and her father, the man who broke her, would do something so astonishing, so completely unexpected, that it would shatter everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and the true meaning of home. Kimmy had always been the quiet anomaly in the loud, ostentatious world of the ADI family, while her father, the powerful chief ADI, relentlessly pursued wealth and the hollow respect of high society, and her older brother Leo carelessly surfed the waves of their father's fortune. Kimmy craved something far simpler, a life built on honesty. At 25 she was a skilled software engineer, a career she had carved out for herself through sleepless nights fueled by cheap coffee and an unyielding determination. She never once asked her family for a single penny, a fact that seemed to irritate her father more than impress him. No matter her achievements, her father always found a way to subtly, or not so subtly, remind her that she was an outsider in her own home. Chief ADI was a man sculpted from pride and ambition, a man who believed that power and position were the ultimate currencies. In his eyes, Kimmy's quiet independence wasn't a strength but a rebellion, an insult to the empire he had built. During lavish family gatherings, he would parade Leo around, his voice booming with pride as he called him the future of the ADI name. Meanwhile, Kimmy would sit in a corner, nursing a drink, a polite, vacant smile plastered on her face, pretending the sting of his words didn't reach her. Deep down, the constant dismissal was a slow-acting poison. But she had long ago learned to swallow her pain and call it strength. The night everything shattered began, as most disasters do, quietly. At the dinner table, her father slid a thick stack of documents across the polished wood towards her, his expression unreadable. "Sign these," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion. It was a contract, a massive deal involving government funds, and a single glance at the fine print made Kimmy's stomach churn. It was blatantly illegal. "Just sign it, Kimmy," he repeated, a sharp edge to his voice now. "Your name, your reputation, for being so meticulous, gives it the credibility it needs." Kimmy looked up from the papers, her gaze meeting his. Slowly, deliberately, she shook her head. "I can't, Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper but firm. "It's wrong." Her refusal was a spark in a room full of gasoline. He slammed his massive hand on the table, the silverware rattling as his voice roared through the mansion. "You think you're better than us? You think your little coding job makes you a saint?" The room fell into a deathly silence. Leo immediately dropped his gaze to his plate, suddenly fascinated by his food. Her mother flinched but remained silent, a prisoner of her own fear. Kimmy, however, stood her ground, though hot tears began to well in her eyes. "I'm not better than anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I just want to do what's right." Her integrity only fueled his rage. He pointed a trembling finger toward the grand front door. "Then leave," he bellowed, his face a mask of fury. "If you cannot stand with this family, then you are no longer a part of it. Don't you ever come back?" For a long, heart-stopping moment, Kimmy was paralyzed. She stared at her father, desperately searching his face for a flicker of regret, a sign that he didn't mean it. But all she found was a cold, hard wall of pride. Her mother wouldn't meet her eyes. With a heavy heart, Kimmy turned and walked slowly to her room. She packed a few belongings into a small bag, the silence of the house pressing in on her. As she walked out of the home that no longer felt like hers, she didn't look back. The storm outside began as she drove away, the falling rain a perfect mirror for the tears streaming down her face, blurring the road ahead. She had no destination, no plan, only the crushing certainty that she couldn't go back. She didn't know it then, But this night of unbearable pain was not an end, but a brutal, necessary beginning to a journey that would reshape her entire world. Kimmy eventually found herself in a small, forgotten town where the streets were paved with dust and the buildings leaned on each other for support, with nothing but her one suitcase and a profoundly weary heart. She felt, for the first time in her life, a sense of profound freedom. She rented a tiny one-room apartment above a sleepy bakery. The walls were scarred with cracks, the roof dripped a steady rhythm when it rained, and the old bed groaned with every small movement. But to Kimmy, this humble space was a palace. It was quiet. There were no booming voices, no judgmental stares, no constant, crushing weight of not being good enough. Each morning she would rise with the sun, brew a simple cup of tea, and sit by her small, dusty window with her laptop. Technology had always been her sanctuary, a logical world where she could create something beautiful and functional from lines of code. She began her new life by taking on small freelance projects, fixing buggy websites for local shops, and designing simple systems for neighborhood businesses. The pay was meager, but it was enough. She learned to cook simple, nourishing meals, to save every spare coin, and to find solace in the long, quiet hours of work that stretched deep into the night. Her new neighbors, a curious but kind bunch, often wondered about the solitary young woman, but Kimmy welcomed the anonymity. Silence had become her closest friend. As months bled into a year, a bigger dream began to take root in her mind. She noticed the local farmers in the surrounding villages, hardworking people who struggled to get a fair price for their crops. They grew beautiful, fresh produce but had no efficient way to connect with buyers beyond the local market. An idea sparked in her heart, a way to bridge the gap. What if technology could empower them? With no investors, no family support, and only her aging laptop, she started building a platform from scratch. She called it Chemnet Solutions, a digital marketplace designed to connect small-scale farmers directly with a wider network of buyers. The journey was grueling. It was defined by countless sleepless nights, thousands of lines of code, and a relentless parade of errors and bugs. There were moments of crushing doubt when she would bury her face in her hands and cry silently at her desk, overwhelmed by the feeling that she was chasing an impossible dream. But every morning, she would wipe away her tears, reboot her laptop, and begin again. After a year of relentless, solitary work, Chemnet Solutions was finally ready to launch. At first, it was a whisper. Only a handful of farmers dared to try the new, unfamiliar platform. But soon, that whisper grew into a conversation. Stories began to spread through the villages, stories of a farmer who sold his entire harvest in a single day, of another who got a price 3 times higher than he ever had before. They spoke of the mysterious app that was changing their lives, and of the unknown person behind it. Kimmy never sought the spotlight. She didn't announce her success or contact anyone from her old life. The memory of being cast out was a scar that hadn't faded, so she remained in the shadows, letting her work speak for itself, quietly improving the platform one line of code at a time. Before long, her inbox, once empty, began to fill with messages from investors and tech journalists. They were intrigued by this powerful platform that had emerged from nowhere. She was being offered opportunities she had once only dreamed of. But Kimmy would just smile softly and continue her work. She was no longer Chief Idio's outcast daughter. She was a creator, a builder, a woman who was remaking her world, quietly but with undeniable force. Back in the city, the grand empire of the ADI family was beginning to crumble like a structure built on sand. Chief ADI had constructed his legacy on a foundation of pride, intimidation, and risky shortcuts. For years, his power had been absolute, his name a synonym for respect and fear. But beneath the polished surface of his success lay a tangled web of deceit, bribes, and poorly concealed elite. The reckoning began when his most ambitious project, the one he had tried to force Kimmy into, collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Government auditors began to investigate, and with every file they opened, another crack appeared in his fortress. The fall was swift and brutal. The same influential people who had once sung his praises at dinner parties now whispered about his downfall in hushed tones. The company's bank accounts were frozen. Terrified investors pulled out their money overnight. The workers, who hadn't been paid in months, went on strike, their angry chants echoing outside the gleaming office building. Chief ADI tried to project strength, shouting at his remaining staff and blaming everyone but himself for the catastrophe. He still believed his name was a key that could unlock any door. But this time, all the doors were slamming shut in his face. His empire was in a free fall, and there was no safety net to catch him. Leo, his golden boy, only accelerated the descent. Instead of standing by his father, he vanished into the city's underbelly, spending his nights in high-stakes gambling clubs. Foolishly trying to win back their fortune, he would return home in the early hours of the morning, reeking of desperation and cheap liquor, spinning tales of a big win that was just around the corner. In reality, he was digging their financial grave even deeper. He secretly sold 2 of the family's luxury cars to pay off his mounting debts. When his father inevitably found out, the ensuing argument was volcanic. A storm of accusations and venom that finally ended in a heavy, suffocating silence. The once vibrant mansion was now a tomb, haunted by anger, regret, and a palpable sense of fear. The final blow came one dreary morning when officers from the bank arrived, their faces grim, a stack of official papers in their hands. The mansion, the stage for countless opulent parties and displays of wealth, was being repossessed. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the fleet of expensive cars, everything was gone. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, watching in silence as the once mighty Adai family was reduced to packing their personal belongings into cardboard boxes. The same people who had once begged for an invitation to their dinners now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. Inevitably, the reporters descended like vultures, their cameras flashing and their questions sharp and merciless. Cornered and humiliated, Chief Adui stood before them, his face gaunt, his expensive suit rumpled. "My daughter," he finally yelled, his voice breaking with a toxic mix of rage and self-pity. "She cursed this family the day she left." The headlines spread like wildfire. The story of the fallen chief, abandoned by his own daughter, was on every news channel. But later that night, after the cameras had left and the silence returned, Chief Adi sat alone in the vast, empty living room of the house that was no longer his. For the first time in his life, he had nothing. No power, no wealth, no one to command. His gaze fell upon the single family photo left on the wall, the same one that still sat on Kimmy's dashboard. In it, a much younger Kimmy was smiling, her eyes bright, standing proudly beside him. A wave of guilt, cold and sharp, washed over him. He could shout her name to the cameras, blame her for his ruin, but deep down, in the quietest corners of his heart, he knew the devastating truth he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. It wasn't Kimmy's curse that had destroyed them, it was his own suffocating pride. Months drifted by peacefully as Kimmy poured all of her energy into her work and the quiet, fulfilling life she had meticulously built. Her days were a blur of activity. Chemnet Solutions was flourishing, expanding faster than she could have ever anticipated, and her name was slowly becoming synonymous with innovation in the tech world. Yet, in the stillness of the night, when she sat alone at her small desk, the city lights twinkling below, her thoughts would sometimes wander back home. She would see the faces she had left behind, hear the echoes of the words that had shattered her heart, and feel the phantom slam of the door that had closed on her forever. She would quickly shake off the ghosts of her past, reminding herself that she was stronger now, that her peace was no longer dependent on anyone else's approval. One ordinary afternoon, while sifting through a mountain of client emails, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She almost dismissed it as spam, but an inexplicable urge made her open it. Her world stopped. The blood froze in her veins as she read the simple, desperate words. "Please, Kimmy, it's Dad. I'm sorry. We've lost everything. We need you." Her hands began to tremble violently. The bustling office around her faded into a silent, blurry backdrop. She read the message again, and then a third time, her mind refusing to process the words. It felt surreal, like a ghost from a past life had reached out to touch her. Her memory instantly flashed back to that stormy night, to his face contorted with rage as he screamed, "Don't come back." She remembered the chilling finality of the door slamming shut, the feeling of being utterly alone in the pouring rain. Every cruel word, every bitter tear, every moment of her painful exile came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. A part of her, the wounded child that still lived inside, wanted to feel pity, perhaps even the beginnings of forgiveness, but what rose up instead was a deep, profound ache. "So now he remembers me," she thought, a bitter taste filling her mouth. When she had desperately needed a father's love, he had given her rejection. When she had begged to be seen and heard, he had given her his back. And now, only now, when his kingdom had turned to dust and he had nothing left, did he remember the daughter he had so easily thrown away. Her phone buzzed again, another message from the same number, this one shorter, even more desperate. "Please, my daughter, I'm begging you." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and angry. She wiped them away with the back of her hand. For a long, agonizing moment, she simply stared at the screen, trapped in a war between the person she used to be and the woman she had fought so hard to become. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she tapped the number. She didn't call. She didn't reply. She pressed block, as the contact disappeared from her screen. She whispered to the empty room, her voice trembling but firm, "You told me not to come back." I listened. Kimmy placed her phone face down on the desk and closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The room felt heavy with the weight of her decision, but inside her heart, something shifted. It wasn't a feeling of triumph or revenge. It was a quiet, solid sense of strength. She had finally, unequivocally, chosen herself. The broken girl who had cried outside her father's locked gate had grown into a woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. And though her heart still ached with the memory of what she had lost, she knew one thing for certain. Some distances are the only things that can protect your peace. Kimmy's life accelerated at a dizzying pace. What began as a humble idea in a cramped, one-room apartment had blossomed into a global tech powerhouse. Chemnet Solutions became one of the fastest-growing startups in Africa, a vital lifeline connecting thousands of rural farmers with international buyers. Her name was no longer whispered in small towns. It was printed in bold headlines in major newspapers and business magazines. They called her the visionary who revolutionized rural commerce, a titan of tech with a conscience. Investors from Silicon Valley and London were now the ones sending her messages, pleading for a meeting. Invitations to deliver keynote speeches at prestigious international conferences flooded her inbox. She was living a life that the younger, heartbroken Kimmy could never have imagined. At these events, audiences would hang on her every word, giving her standing ovations when she shared her sanitized journey of resilience. They called her an inspiration, a role model. She would smile graciously, thank them for their kindness, and pose for photographs. But later, when the applause faded and the crowds dispersed, Kimmy would often find herself alone in a luxurious hotel suite, staring out at the glittering skyline of a foreign city, feeling a quiet, hollow emptiness deep inside. Success had brought her everything she had once desperately craved: wealth, recognition, and absolute freedom. But it was a cold comfort. It could not fill the void left by the absence of a family's warmth, however flawed it had been. Sometimes, during interviews, a journalist would ask about her parents. She had a prepared answer, a polite fiction she had repeated so many times it almost felt real. "They're incredibly proud of me," she would say with a practiced smile. It was easier to lie than to excavate the mass grave of her old wounds. But deep down, a part of her still ached, still wished that her father had seen her worth before the rest of the world had. One morning, as she was reviewing the day's mail in her spacious corner office, her secretary handed her a single, plain envelope. It immediately stood out from the pile of corporate correspondence. It wasn't crisp and professional. It was addressed in a slightly shaky, familiar handwriting. Her heart stuttered. On the back, in faint blue ink, was the sender's name, Leo, her brother. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity. Her breath caught in her throat. With trembling fingers, she finally tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper, folded neatly into a small square. As she unfolded it, the letter began with words that felt like a punch to the gut. "Dear Kimmy, I know I'm the last person on earth you want to hear from." He wrote about how things had spiraled even further downward at home. He told her their father was sick, gravely ill, and rarely left his bed anymore. And then came the confession, the truth that had been buried for years, the truth that had cost her everything. He admitted that he, Leo, was the one who had forged their father's signature on the illegal deal. When their father found out, she had unknowingly taken the blame. And her father had let her tears blur the words on the page. The deep-seated anger she had carried for years, her shield and her armor, began to crack, clashing violently with a fresh wave of heartbreak and utter confusion. She could almost hear Leo's desperate voice as she read the final lines. "Please come home, Kimmy, please, before it's too late." Kimmy sat motionless, the letter clutched in her hand. The world outside her panoramic window was bright and bustling, but inside her, a storm had been unleashed. For the first time in years, success didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a gilded cage. She was faced with an impossible question. Should she return to the home that had betrayed and discarded her? Or should she continue walking forward, leaving the ghosts of her past to bury themselves? Kimmy read the letter again, then a third time, her mind desperately trying to find a flaw in its devastating logic. But every word was a clear, sharp indictment of the past. Her brother Leo had finally unearthed the truth he had kept buried for so long. "Dad only shouted at you because of me," he had written. "I forged his signature on that deal. When he found out, he couldn't face the humiliation of his own son's failure. So he blamed you. He thought he was protecting me, but he destroyed you instead. Kimmy's hands shook so badly the paper rattled. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the memories played back in her mind, now cast in a horrific new light. The shouting, the searing humiliation, the lonely drive into the storm. For all these years, she had carried the weight of her father's rage, believing it stemmed from his profound disappointment in her. She thought he truly despised her for being different, for choosing integrity over loyalty. But Leo's words twisted that entire narrative into something far more tragic and painful. The letter continued, each word a fresh stab wound. Dad is sick now, really sick. The doctor says he doesn't have much time left. He keeps asking for you, Kimmy. He calls your name in his sleep. Please, I'm begging you, come home before it's too late. She placed the letter carefully on her desk and stared blankly at the wall, her chest so tight she could barely breathe. All the air seemed to have been sucked from the room. She didn't know whether to scream in rage or collapse in a heap of tears. The truth had arrived far too late, after years of painful loneliness. After she had clawed her way back from nothing and rebuilt herself piece by agonizing piece. She thought of the father who had branded her a disgrace, the man whose monumental pride had crushed her spirit. And now that same man was old, frail, and asking for her. Despite everything, a treacherous part of her heart still yearned for him. No matter how deep she tried to bury it, the love for her father was a stubborn root. She walked to the window, watching the city below. The world had moved on, but her past had returned. Not with a roar, but with a soft, desperate knock, asking to be acknowledged. Why now? She whispered to her reflection. Why, after all this time? A fresh wave of anger surged through her, not just at her father, but at Leo. He had stood by and watched her suffer. He had remained silent as she was cast out into the world alone. And now he was the one asking her to return. She clenched the letter in her fist, tears of frustration and grief finally sliding down her cheeks. Her heart was a battlefield, torn between the instinct to protect the peace she had fought so hard to win and a deep, primal compassion. Part of her wanted to burn the letter and never look back, but another part, a small, quiet voice inside her, whispered a terrifying question. What if this is your last chance to say goodbye? Kimmy sank into her chair, clutching the letter to her chest. In that moment, she wasn't the powerful CEO everyone saw. She was just a daughter again, broken, lost, and standing at the most painful crossroads of her life. A place where the path to the future was blocked by the unforgiving ghost of the past. For days, Kimmy existed in a fog. Sleep offered no escape. She would lie awake in her silent apartment, staring at the ceiling, Leo's words echoing in the darkness. The letter had pried open wounds she had convinced herself were healed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face as she remembered it, powerful, proud, and radiating disapproval. But now, that image was haunted by the one Leo had painted, a sick, fragile old man, broken by regret, whispering her name. She tried to fight it, to bury herself in work, but her heart refused to be silenced. One morning, in the quiet pre-dawn hours, she made a decision. She packed a small overnight bag, her movements slow and deliberate, and got into her car. The drive back to her hometown felt infinitely longer than she remembered. Every familiar landmark, every bend in the road, triggered a cascade of memories she had spent years trying to suppress. Childhood laughter, teenage arguments, the deep, rumbling sound of her father's voice calling her name from across the yard. A knot of anxiety tightened in her chest as she turned onto her old street. The neighborhood, once so vibrant in her memory, now seemed tired and gray. When she finally pulled up in front of the ADI mansion, her breath caught in her throat. The grand, imposing house she had fled years ago was a shadow of its former self. It stood silent and faded, the paint peeling from its walls like sunburnt skin. The once manicured gates were tinged with rust, and the garden, which her mother had tended with such love, was now a tangled mess of weeds. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a monument to a life that had ended long ago. She hesitated at the front door, her hand hovering over the bell. Before she could ring it, the door creaked open. Leo stood there. His face was etched with exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot and heavy. He looked years older. He didn't say a word, just stepped aside and let her in. The inside of the house was cold and still, the air thick with sadness. As she walked down the long hallway, she noticed the family portraits were still hanging on the wall. In one, a small gap-toothed version of herself was beaming, perched happily on her father's shoulders. Her footsteps slowed as she approached the living room. There, sitting in a wheelchair positioned by the large bay window, was Chief ADI. He was nothing like the Titan she remembered. His once black hair was now a shock of thin white strands. His body was frail, swallowed by a thick robe. When he heard her enter, he turned his head with a slow, pained effort. The moment their eyes met, Kimmy froze. His were filled with a universe of unshed tears. His lips trembled as he tried to speak her name. He struggled to push himself up from the chair, a desperate, futile gesture. His voice, when it came, was a ragged, broken whisper. "I told you not to come back," he rasped, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down his wrinkled cheek. "But I prayed every single night that you would." Kimmy's heart constricted with a pain so intense it felt physical. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to flee back to the safety of the life she had built. But her feet were rooted to the floor. The mountain of anger and resentment she had carried for so long didn't disappear. But it was suddenly joined by something else as strange, quiet, overwhelming sadness. Looking at her father, so utterly helpless and broken, she realized that time and regret had already delivered a punishment far harsher than any she could have imagined. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stood there, letting the heavy silence between them say everything words could not. The rage inside her didn't vanish, but it began to soften, its sharp edges melting away, piece by painful piece, into something that felt terrifyingly close to forgiveness. Chief Adi looked at his daughter, his eyes a swirling mix of guilt and profound pain. His voice was weak, trembling like a man who had carried an impossible weight for far too long. He told her everything, unburdening his soul of every lie, every mistake, every selfish, prideful decision. He finally admitted the truth about that fateful night. It wasn't her. It was Leo. Her beloved brother had forged his signature on a disastrous business deal. When the chief discovered the betrayal, his pride couldn't withstand the public shame of his son's actions. So, instead of facing the truth, he chose a scapegoat. He aimed all his rage and disappointment at Kimmy, the one person in his family who had always been unwaveringly honest. "I couldn't face the world knowing my son, my heir, had betrayed me," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the floor. "So, I punished my daughter instead. I told myself it was for the good of the family name, but it was just my ego, my pathetic ego. I ruined everything." Kimmy stood perfectly still, listening as the truth she never knew she needed broke her heart all over again. All those years of feeling worthless, the sleepless nights spent questioning her own value, the deep-seated belief that she was fundamentally unlovable, it was all built on a lie told to protect a man's pride. She wanted to scream, to demand why he hadn't trusted her, why he had let her walk out that door with her spirit shattered into a million pieces. But the words were trapped in her throat. She could only stare at the frail man who had once been a giant in her eyes, now diminished and broken before her. Chief Adi wiped at his tears with a trembling hand. "You were always the strong one, Kimmy," he continued softly. "I always thought power was about control, about making people fear you. But you showed me what real strength is. You built a new life from the ashes of the one I burned down. You did it with integrity and courage, not with anger. I was just too blind and too proud to see it." Her lips trembled. She didn't know what to say. Forgiveness wasn't a switch she could just flip. It wasn't something she could grant in an instant to erase years of pain. But as she looked at him, consumed by a regret that seemed to be physically eating him away, she no longer saw the tyrant who had disowned her. She saw a father who had reached the end of his life and had finally understood what love was supposed to mean. Without a word, Kimmy closed the distance between them and reached out, her hand gently covering his. His rough, cold fingers trembled beneath her touch. That simple gesture, that small point of contact, conveyed everything she couldn't say: the pain, the lingering love, the immense loss, and a tiny, fragile spark of healing. Tears streamed down both of their faces now, one in regret, the other in a complex flood of sorrow and release. "Thank you," Chief Adi whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not turning into me." Kimmy looked at him, and through her own tears, she managed a faint, watery smile. For the first time in over a decade, there was a true silence between them, not the cold, hostile silence of anger, but the quiet, gentle silence of understanding. It wasn't complete forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of peace. And in that quiet, shared moment, both father and daughter finally felt the crushing weight of the past begin to lift. In the weeks that followed that raw, emotional reunion, Kimmy found herself walking the deserted halls of her father's company. The towering glass building, once a gleaming symbol of power, now felt like a mausoleum, dull, empty, and forgotten. Most of the employees were long gone, and the few who remained wandered the corridors like ghosts, their faces etched with uncertainty. As Kimmy passed her father's old office, memories came rushing back, the echo of his booming voice, the sting of her dreams being dismissed. But she was no longer that wounded girl. She was a leader, tempered by hardship and filled with a quiet, unshakable resolve. She made a bold decision. She would rebuild the company, not to restore her father's tarnished name, but for the hundreds of innocent families whose livelihoods had been destroyed by his pride. She called a meeting with the skeleton crew that remained. "We're going to start over," she announced, her voice clear and steady. "We're not going to build for power, but for purpose." For the first time in years, a flicker of hope ignited in their tired eyes. Leo stood in the back of the room during that meeting, his head bowed in shame. He couldn't bring himself to meet his sister's gaze, crushed by the weight of the devastation his actions had caused. To his astonishment, after the meeting, Kimmy approached him. "If you are truly ready to change," she said gently, but with a firm edge, "I will give you a place here, not as the boss's son, but as my assistant. You will start from the bottom, and you will learn what real work and real leadership mean." He looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, tears welling instantly. He knew he didn't deserve a second chance, let alone her forgiveness, but she was offering it anyway. From that day forward, Leo worked with a humility he had never known. He followed her instructions, took notes in meetings, and watched in awe as she treated every single employee, from the janitor to the senior managers, with respect and fairness, the complete antithesis of their father's tyrannical rule. Slowly, miraculously, the company began to breathe again. Chief ADI, now confined to his home, would sit by the window for hours, listening as Kimmy shared updates from the office. With each piece of good news, his eyes would fill with a mixture of immense pride and deep sorrow. He saw in his daughter the leader he had always wanted to be but never knew how. He saw that true greatness wasn't about dominance, but about compassion. Not about control, but about wisdom. One evening, as Kimmy sat by his bedside, reading aloud a glowing report on the company's first profitable quarter, he reached for her hand and smiled faintly. "You didn't just come back, Kimmy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You became everything I ever prayed my children would be." His voice cracked on the last word, but his eyes were, for the first time she could remember, completely at peace. Kimmy squeezed his hand, her own heart heavy but calm. She had rebuilt what was broken, not just a business, but the spirit of a family that had been lost for so long. She hadn't chosen revenge, she had chosen redemption. And in doing so, she had given her father the two greatest gifts he could ever receive: pride in his daughter, and peace in his heart before he took his final breath. Months after her father passed away, Kimmy stood on a brightly lit stage, looking out at a sea of faces. Hundreds of young entrepreneurs had gathered to hear her speak, their eyes filled with a familiar mixture of hope, ambition, and unspoken fear. Her heart beat a soft, steady rhythm against her ribs. It felt like only yesterday that she had been one of them, a lost soul trying desperately to prove her worth to a world that seemed determined to reject her. Now, she stood before them, not as the broken girl who had been cast out, but as a woman who had learned to build a home within her own scars. She took a slow, centering breath and began to speak. Her voice was calm, yet it carried the immense weight of her journey. "Sometimes," she said, her gaze sweeping across the auditorium, "the people who push you away the hardest are the ones who need your light the most, but you can't go back for them. You can't go back for revenge or to prove them wrong." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You can only go back once you've built such an unbreakable peace within yourself that nothing they say or do can ever destroy it again." A profound silence fell over the hall. In that quiet, you could feel the collective weight of 1,000 untold stories of betrayal, pain, and quiet perseverance. Her words were not just a speech, they were a raw, healing truth. On the large screen behind her, a photograph appeared. It was an old one, of a much younger Kimmy, laughing, sitting on her father's shoulders, a world away, before their lives had grown so cold. She turned to look at it for a moment, a faint, bittersweet smile touching her lips. Then, leaning closer to the microphone, she whispered, so softly it was almost just for herself, "You told me not to come back, Dad, but I did. Not for you. I came back for me." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. A few people wiped away tears. Kimmy's own eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She simply smiled, the kind of deep, knowing smile that comes only when profound pain has finally, truly found its peace. In the days that followed, clips of her speech went viral. People across the globe shared it with captions like, "This story just healed a part of me I didn't know was broken, and forgiveness is not for them, it's for you." Kimmy's name became a trending topic, but she paid little attention to the newfound fame. What mattered was that her story, once a private narrative of rejection and loneliness, had transformed into a public message of hope. She had proven that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past or pretending the wounds were never inflicted. It's about becoming strong enough to let go of the anger, to rise from the ashes, and to shine again. Not in spite of your scars, but because of them. As she stepped off that stage into the bright, welcoming lights, she knew her journey had come full circle. Love, even after it has been broken, can still be rebuilt into something far more beautiful and resilient than it was before.